Before the 1920s, going to college was really affordable, sometimes even free. But about 100 years later, that's no longer the case. In 1980, the average cost to attend a four-year university was a little over $10,000 a year. Today, that number has almost tripled. The rising cost of higher education has been a huge burden for American families. But how did college get so expensive in the first place? Before the 40s, a college education was mostly something wealthy people going into public service work pursued. Not only was the cost low, but it also wasn't really a burden for the majority of wealthy students. But as the economy tanked in the 20s, higher education institutions slowly started raising tuition. And then, World War II happened. And it sort of changed everything. In 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the GI Bill into law. By providing financial assistance for tuition costs, the GI Bill made college affordable for World War II veterans. And the policy worked. The GI Bill got some 8 million veterans enrolled in college. That's 10 times more than the bill's authors had ever expected would take them up on the offer. And between 1940 and 1950, the number of higher education degree holders in the country more than doubled. This rise in demand could have made prices of education go up, but at the same time, states were on board with the idea of paying for the majority of college costs. Meanwhile, the federal government wanted to do its part too, and so, in 1958, we got the National Defense Education Act, which offered grants, scholarships, and student loans to prospective college students who showed promise in math, science, and engineering. And it worked. More and more people had access to higher education because more were receiving financial assistance. The thinking around college education shifted during this era. Suddenly, college wasn't just something for rich people.
Poverty must not be a bar to learning, and learning must offer an escape from poverty.
But of course, there were still many people who were left out. So, in 1965, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, the Higher Education Act was passed, making colleges and universities more accessible to low-income and minority students by providing them with need-based grants, work-study opportunities, and the federal student loan program. The measure was a game-changer. These grants created more socioeconomic and racial diversity on campuses, and the demand for school soared. But then, things really started to shift in the 70s. Inflation was in the double digits, and there was an oil embargo.
Gasoline stations ran dry.
All around, the post-war economic success seen after World War II was dwindling. As a result, public investment in education started to fade on both the federal and state levels. Look at California, for instance, which, up until 1970, offered free tuition for all in-state residents. The state stopped offering free tuition thanks in large part to Ronald Reagan, who became governor of California in 1967. Reagan made big cuts to the state's education funding, which resulted in higher education institutions losing 20% of their annual funding. So in order to fill the gap, colleges and universities increased their prices for those who wanted to attend them. This move to a tuition-centered funding model in California went national when Reagan became president in 1981 and set a precedent for similar policies across the country. As states cut funding for education, colleges relied more on tuition directly paid by students, who relied more on student loans, a cycle that has been in motion for decades and has contributed to the current student loan debt crisis. Today, the average cost of just tuition and fees for a four-year public university has risen from $804 in 1980 to $9,349 in 2020. For private institutions, tuition has risen from $3,617 in 1980 to over $32,769 in 2020. That's not even including room and board. What's more is that all of these factors have created a student loan debt crisis that has resulted in a cumulative federal student loan debt of $1.6 trillion, leaving millions of Americans with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars hanging over their heads.
For so many people, student debt is something holding them back from everything they want to do in their lives. It's something that's been a huge barrier for me personally.
It's $27,816 that I would be owing.
Here's the thing. The cost of getting a college education keeps going up, but the amount of money you can make after getting a degree has not kept up the pace. And with states and the federal government no longer providing the assistance they used to, folks pursuing a career have no choice but to get into serious debt. So, higher education will never truly be affordable until legislation making college free is passed into law, finally solidifying that higher education really is a public good.